All right, well, I guess we'll get started here. Want to welcome everybody to the EBEX webinar. It's going to be presented by Joe Owens. He's got 15 plus years as an ERP consultant and is certified in finance, trade, logistics, and HR. So he's going to take us through the employee life cycle in AX 2012, all the way from hiring all the way to retiring. So I'm sure this will be informative for everybody. Just so that we can keep the noise down, I've got everybody on mute. So I hope you'll, if you have any questions or anything, use the question panel within the GoToMeeting. And if we have time at the end, we'll cover questions. And if we don't have time at the end, we'll make sure to follow up with you and get back to you with any questions you have. All right? So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get going here. Just a little bit about yes, all that little stuff at the bottom. Okay. A little bit about us here at EBEX. We are a Microsoft exclusive partner and consultancy firm, and we are gold certified in ERP, CRM, and business intelligence. We have been a member of the Inner Circle and the President's Club for a number of years, which means we're in the top 10 partners in the world. We've just won that again for 2015. And we've been Partner of the Year and UK Reseller of the Year multiple times. And again, we just got that for 2015. So some of our accolades there. We are very much focused on our people. We invest in our people. Our consultants are all highly trained and Microsoft certified. We have a very close relationship with Microsoft, so we're always up to date with the latest CUs coming out and the latest versions coming out, like AX7 coming out next year. We have a really strong graduate program, which is able to really quickly bring people on board and get them trained up and certified to a really high standard. All right. So that's a little bit about us and EBEX, and we'll talk about some next steps at the end of the charts, but I think I'll go ahead now and pass along to Joe so we can get started here.
All right.
There you go.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Morning, evening, wherever you happen to be on the time spectrum. So as Laura said, I am Joe Owens. I am a Dynamics AX consultant specializing in the HR and payroll areas. And today we're going to just basically take a high-level overview and look at the HR module in its core structure and talk about some of the things that you can do with it. One of the things, there have been significant changes and improvements since way back in the 2009 product, and that's pretty much across the board with AX in general, but particularly with the HR, I believe it's become more in demand, and Microsoft has been giving quite a bit more attention to it. And one of the things that works in line with the HR module, as well as the rest of the modules, is some of the changes to the organization structure. The HR is basic building blocks happens with the organization structure that if you happen to be current AX users, you probably already have some of this in place. So again, these are the basic building blocks that then HR takes and builds the human capital management component to that. So this webinar is basically going to go through the employee life cycle from hire to retire. We're going to take a little bit of a step back from looking at the core product just in and of itself and talk a little bit about the recruitment process. We're not going to get too much into detail on that. We're actually going to have another webinar on Friday that's going to get into a little more detail on the recruitment process, particularly in focusing on how to use some of the competency maintenance, looking at skills, education, certifications, and some of the analysis reporting that you can do to make sure that, in your recruiting process while using AX 2012, you can utilize some of that to ensure you get the best candidates. But again, there's gonna be a little bit of an overlap, so we'll talk a little bit about some of this in our webinar today. So here's a bit of a overview of the worker life cycle and what we're going to talk about in the webinar today. So we're going to go through a little bit of the recruitment and show some of the high points. We're going to get into the organization structure and talk about the job position relationship. That's a very important element in setting up and maintaining the core HR product, and of course how that deals with managing your employee information. And then we'll go through the basic processes of hiring, transitioning workers to other departments or other organization units, and then the retirement process. And then we'll look at a few of the basic canned demographic reporting that's available in the HR module. So here's a little graphical overview of kind of the processes. So we'll go through the recruitment and the application and applicant elements to that, talk about the job and position relationship, and then how a worker obtains a position assignment. I use this little graphic of a chair here because I often like to use the analogy that the position is the chair or the seat where the worker sits. So with that all in mind, let's go ahead and I'm going to shift gears here. We're going to jump into the application and look at all the elements in place. Let my screen refresh here. So if you're showing a blank screen, that's on my side. Uh-oh. Catch up here. Sorry. All right, here we go. So I have my screen open to the main human resources area page. And if you're current AX users, you're generally probably familiar with the interface. Most of the layout is the same as all the other modules. Most of what we'll be doing today, we'll be working with in our common forums here. So I'm going to go ahead and expand out recruitment. So we step back to the very beginning of the process, pre-hire, if you will. There's really a couple of main elements that come into play in the recruitment process in AX, but it's all going to start with a recruitment project. And if you look on the screen here, you have some existing recruitment projects that we have here, and a couple of different statuses that you will track throughout that process. So as an HR specialist in recruiting, while you're maintaining the recruitment projects, you're also managing these project statuses. So if I look at my list here, today for our demonstration, we're going to focus on the sales associate project. Now, a recruitment project is associated to a job. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Now, in a little while, we're going to talk in quite a bit of detail on the job position relationship. I've discovered that's kind of probably one of the biggest learning curves of understanding HR and kind of keeping terminology straight. In the real world, if we look at a job and a position, typically those are interchangeable terms. AX HR has very specific levels that these jobs and positions work on. So as we go through this, that's one of the things I want to highlight. What's actually happening on the job, what's actually happening on the position. So with the job, we can think of what information is being stored there. And for a job, we think of a job description. So while we're talking about the recruitment, we know we have an opening for a job, and that has associated requirements to that job. Now, typically a recruitment project is going to be a one-to-one for that. So we may have a project opening for a specific job, as you see here in sales associate, but we may have multiple positions open for that job. So one of the things we're going to look at, like I said, a little later, is how you may have multiple positions for a single job. So for our example that we're looking here, we just have one opening. Some information is tracked here, the recruiter, this project status is started, so we're actually in the active recruitment process looking at this. There's one opening. There's some contact information for the hiring manager or any alternative contact, and then some dating elements here. We can track the date that a recruitment requisition was approved on. Now, one thing I want to point out is there's not a whole lot of behind-the-scenes requisitioning process out of the box. There's some workflows and some things that can be built to accommodate that. But out of the box, typically, you're tracking that from, when that date is there. The date the position is open, any deadline for the application, the close date of that, and then the estimated start date for the actual job itself. Another thing that can be tracked on the job, a couple of things here, I'm going to open up some fast tabs, is the ability to maintain a job advertisement and actually have that display and open applications on your intranet through the enterprise portal. But as you can see here, I can attach that job advertisement and put that description in. If I click on this here, it's just basically typing that free-form information in, and then I can go in and edit and change that. But if I have this checkbox marked, that will actually publish that job ad to my intranet on the enterprise portal, and you can have people actually apply that way. Another thing that you can track here is media information. If you're advertising via the web, like Monster or Yahoo Jobs, that type of thing, newspapers or whatever, and just some basic information that you can track on that. If you want to add a vendor, you can add address, contact information, just some basic tracking information on the media that you might use to advertise your jobs for your recruitment project. So again, this is kind of the shell that stores everything. Now there's two main components to what happens with the recruitment project. And they're somewhat interchangeable, but kind of think of the component to that is you have the actual application. So if I look here at my recruitment project for my sales associate, you'll see I have a listing of the applications that I've received for that. And then I can filter my view here based on the statuses that I would go through. So I can look at those just received, any that's confirmed, that's in an interview process, that I've marked as rejection, canceled, or finally employed. Now, I'm just going to open that up all. So these would be all the applications that I have received on this particular recruitment project and the associated applicant and that information. So let me drill in here to one of my applicants. This is basic information about the application that you've received. The name of the applicant, and again, so that is kind of a separate record. And that applicant record assigns a unique ID so that you can maintain information. Let's say somebody applies for multiple jobs within your organizations. It doesn't have to create multiple applicant records. Now there would be separate applications because they would, involve different information for particular jobs that you're recruiting for. But the applicant itself receives a unique identification number to keep that straight, so you only have one record in the database. An applicant type, if it's external or internal. Again, the media, we're tracking that on. Basic status information on the dates, if you're traveling, some costing here. You also have a rating number, and that deals with the skills. And that's where, again, we're not going to get too much into that for the purpose of this webinar. Kind of save that for the next one. And then we have the associated organization elements that are tied to that job. So we would have our department and then the actual job record itself. Again, our enterprise portal link, and then if that application is employed, we would have a start date, grade time. Now, a couple of things that happen on the application itself, we can set up interviews. So if I want to schedule an interview with the hiring manager, I can do that through here and send that in Outlook. I can route my application to other workers to look at so they can see that information. I can track accommodations information. We'll talk about this a little more on the job. But one of the things when we set up a job, we're setting up job requirements. And for ADA, Americans with Disability Act, any accommodations that need to be tracked as far as like physical limitations, if a job requires a certain amount of lifting, standing, whatever, those type of things, or anything that needs to be accommodated for disabilities, that stuff can be tracked as well. Now so as we talked about some of the statuses here that if we go through, so we would confirm, we would set up an interview, reject or cancel. We can also set up letter and email templates that are associated with these statuses. So if we needed to set up and create a form letter to establish the interview and have that sent in an email, or set up a rejection letter. Thank you for your interest in our company. Another candidate has been filed. So, within AX, the framework, you can set up, shell documents that we can then come here and generate those from letters and emails as well. Okay, so, and again, I can open my fast tabs here if I routed my application or any upcoming scheduled interviews. I can look at those. Sorry. Look at that there. Oh, sorry. Application. Okay, the next thing I can do here, so I've received my application. The other element to this in the database is that applicant, of course. And this is where you're actually getting the personal information about that applicant. Some basic applicant information here. First name, last name, information about their job, degree information, how many applications they may have in there, if you want to mark them for future consideration, if they've been a previous employee, setting it up for skill mapping. Again, that's not going to be in scope for this webinar, but if you want to sit in on the next one Friday, that we'll talk about that. Factual information, we have address, contact information with phone number, email, personal information. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that by completing this information, a couple things happen. This information can be imported from a resume. So if I actually go back here to my PowerPoint, talked a little bit about this. This is a resume report, but by getting a resume, you can import all this information in, and you're actually creating the record in the database. So, saving redundancy of data entry. Once the applicant information is in here and they're hired, all of this information is going to be brought in to create that worker record. Again, a couple of things you can look at here. So we've noticed that our guy here, Aiden, has some multiple applications. We could go out and look at that to see where there are other applications, other jobs that they may have applied for. Again, the interviews, accommodations, reference information, if you have that stored, you can add that in here. And then their basic competencies, their skills, professional experience, education, tests, certificates, positions of trust, projects, experiences, courses. Again, all of this stuff is kind of managed and carries on into other functionality in the HR module. But simply for informational purposes, you would store this at the applicant record. So those are the primary elements of our recruitment process. So again, we have our recruitment projects, our applications, and applicants. So looking back at our recruitment process here, and I'll just show you this quickly. It's kind of a teaser preview for looking at the other webinar I've talked about. I can go out here and I can run a skills profile report, skill mapping profile. And by doing that, if I have my competency set up, I can take a recruitment project opening here, and I can set the criteria based on what I'm actually looking for, certification, or skills, or education. And when I generate that, I can get a report that's going to show me my strongest candidate. So for the sales associate opening that we've been looking at here, it looks like our guy Don Rosler is the best one, and he scored 12 points at 80%. And again, there's some a lot of underpinning elements that set that up, but you can drill in and look a little bit more details on that particular one. We can also just generate that into a report, and this report kind of shows us a little bit more of what criteria that we set up based on those competencies to get this. So with that being said, we've kind of have a profile analysis that we can look at on our recruitment project for who our best candidate is. So I'm going to select our sales associate here, and let's find our candidate, Dawn. And again, so it looks like he's been interviewed. So we're going to say that Dawn is our guy. So. Now at this point, I can actually go in and I can hire Dawn as a new worker. This is basically going to give some information here. Personnel number, it's going to assign. Our worker type, there are two types of workers in our system. There is an employee and a contractor. I'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. The start date of employment, and then assigning a position. Here's where I want to back up a little bit and talk about the job-position relationship. I've used these terms already throughout what we've talked about, but I think it bears going into and looking at this in a little deeper. Now, one of the things that we have is your core organization structure. And the base building blocks of those are your legal entities. And if you recall at the beginning of our webinar, I mentioned that if you're a current AX user, chances are you probably have some of this, if not all of it, in place up to at least the point of adding jobs and positions. So if I have my legal entities, and I have operating units as departments set up, I can actually build a department hierarchy. And this basically just sets up a visual organization chart in the system to track different hierarchies. And I can drill in and I can get additional information for that. Now the job kind of sits out by itself. Let me switch over here to my, so talking about the job and position relationship, kind of to try to keep these often interchangeable terms straight, you can think of it this way. A job is what work is getting done, what what is required to fill that job. The position is where the work gets done, and then the worker is who does the work. So with that in mind, if we look out here, we see a listing of all of our jobs. Now, one thing is this information is shared across companies. So at this level, we would see all of the associated jobs in our organization. So for example, if I look at my account manager here, certain information is tracked at the job level, and this is kind of what's important to note. We talked about those ADA requirements. So in our recruiting process, if we needed to manage that, we could set those up here and put those requirements on the job. We have a job title. Now, one thing I'll point out is that the job title is a separate table. So some organizations, I've heard the term business card title used. Sometimes the organization may track a description for a job title, like you have here, but their actual personal title is something different. So AX allows you to manage that on a separate level. You can limit the number of positions associated with that job, establish a full-time equivalent ratio. There are some categorization features to this by a job type and function and additional description information. Compensation information, if you're using the AX compensation module, a lot of that information is dependent at the job level. For example, tracking levels and compensation grids. We won't go into too much detail on that, but just so you know, some of the things come into play there. And then, of course, our competencies that we've talked about. So here is where we would manage and maintain on the job level those competency requirements for skills, certificates, tests, education, any screenings, things like a drug screening or background checks, that can be tracked here if those are required. Job tasks in order to do that job, any areas of responsibility. So again, we would track our competencies at the job level for that. Now looking here at our account manager job, if we look over here in this FAST tab, we'll see that we actually have excuse me. We actually have multiple positions that are associated to that job. So our job is fairly generic. Our account manager, again, what work gets done. The position is where the work gets done, and you'll see here the actual workers who are associated to those positions. So I would go ahead and select one of our position records here for our account manager. Now again, keeping in mind different information is getting tracked at each level. Some of the information is inherited. So anything, the skill requirements that we would put on the job would show that. That job title, that's also inherited at the position. And again, some compensation things. The important thing to keep in mind at this point, though, is that a worker is getting assigned to a position. So while a job has multiple positions associated with it, there's no actual interaction to the worker with that. When the worker gets a position assignment, that is where it actually ties it to the organization. So you'll see here that we have an associated job for our account manager, and it is assigned to our client services department. So we talked a little bit about the organization structure. Here is where that link is made. And I can drill in here. Sorry, my mouse is kind of floating with the leg. And again, if I look at the list of my departments, I can go here and get, a little more information on what I have for my hierarchy. Now, in addition to our department hierarchy, another thing that the position level allows for is a reporting hierarchy or reports to position. So here is where I can manage supervisors. So when I set up a position, I assign that position to a reporting to position. And one thing to keep in mind, this being a very position-based system, that's where those links are generally happening. So that wouldn't necessarily be that your worker would be reporting to another worker, but reporting to another position. So that's one thing kind of from a design standpoint you have to keep in mind with this system. But if I look at that, then I actually see that my account manager reports to my practice manager. And what I can actually do then, I can view that in a hierarchy, and then I get something that's visually similar to the department hierarchy. But here I'm actually seeing my organization from a people standpoint. So I've got my practice manager here, Ben, and then the worker, the position we've been looking at for our account manager here is Roxanne. And typically these would probably all be other account managers. And then I can drill in and I can look at their subordinates. Or I can go back up all the way to the top of my organization here and then look at how everything breaks out. And you'll see this little number represents, it's at a certain point the screen gets pretty busy. But again, just kind of gives you a graphical representation of how our reporting relationship builds a hierarchy for the position. Okay. Got a lot of open windows here. Let me shut some of this down. Okay, so we've looked at our account manager here. Again, we are reporting equivalent. The important thing to keep in mind is our worker assignment and the duration of a position. When new positions are created, it's given a duration time. So that when that position becomes new, it's newly activated. And by default, it will never be retired unless you manually choose to do so. Or if it's a temporary position, you can automatically set a date of retirement or when that position will no longer be able to be filled. But the important thing, again, to keep in mind here is that our worker receives a worker assignment. Now, this is almost always associated with the worker start date, but those are two separate things, and I kind of want to show you. I'll explain this and then kind of go and show you visually how this works. But if you recall one of the early slides I showed you, I had the graphic of a chair, and I explained that I use the analogy that a position is kind of the actual chair that worker sits in. So the worker is always going to be 1-to-1 ratio with the position. So while you have the ability to have a worker have multiple position assignments, and I'll probably adjust our FTE ratio there to 0.5 in one position or 0.5 in the other. I'm actually going to go out here. And we want to look at our I'm going to go back to the recruitment project, and I'm going to look at our sales associate. And if you recall, we were going to hire Dawn. So when I select to hire Dawn here, again, now some of this might make a little more sense. We talked a little bit about worker type, and again, that can be employee or contractor. They're essentially the same. A little bit of information is tracked, or you just have the ability to just differentiate between workers and employees and contractors. Sorry. one of the changes they made, and again, it often feels like a redundancy of terms, but our worker record is central database record, and then it has a worker type of employer contractor. So again, I would have my employment start date, but notice I have my assign a position checkbox there. And that would allow me to select and make that position assignment. And this is where the hiring element really kicks into place when I create that position assignment. So again, typically these dates would be associated. So I'm going to click on Hire New Worker. And now I have my worker record. And the worker record is really the meat of what AXHR has. This is the information pretty much of everything on your worker. And you can see that the information from my application will have already been brought in here in my applicant. So all of that information that was stored on the applicant and application record will be brought in here. So on our profile, we have our address information, our contact information, and then some basic personal information like marital status, number of dependents, ethnic origin, birth date, a lot of information you can see here, military service information. And then down here, some additional information I want to point out to you. Again, we talked a little bit about the accommodations. You can track bank account information. You can track government and organizational IDs. And these are typical things. Well, one thing I'll point out, the main thing that this is used for our U.S. clients, or actually any, even internationally, we would have things like Social Security number or their national ID. That information is tracked here, and mainly that's because this is a global system, so it's not limited. Earlier versions actually had a Social Security number field, but it'll track injury and illness incidents. And this is actually pretty complex. I think we could probably spend quite a bit of time on this, showing date information, costing information, but quite a bit you can track on that. Labor unions, this is pretty much just informational if I needed to track that. You have the ability to loan equipment. So if I hire Don and I want to give him a laptop or a card key, something like that, let's give him a laptop. I can pick out that laptop, and it can even be, I can leave it open-ended, or I can, set an expiration and get an alert on that. Any personal contacts, this also works in line with the benefits module, which is out of scope for this webinar, but the ability to track dependent and beneficiary information comes from this. But this is just a basic emergency contact information. And then, of course, as I mentioned, benefits. And then our screenings, things like our pre-employment drug screen or background check, that kind of stuff. So all that's tracked here in our worker summary profile. Our employment information, this is our key dating information. And again, differentiating, we have our position assignment date and the date of our employment start, and then some other additional dating information you can get here. That's pretty self-explanatory. Any kind of notice requirements that you want to capture. You have the ability to track I-9 information for the U.S., so this is the key immigration information that all new hires have to fill out. And this just allows you basically to track the documentation. So, if I wanted to go here and mark that, I actually looked at their passport, so I can set that information up here and enter all of that in, and actually keep an I-9 record here on your worker record. Terms of employment, all of this can be set up, and I can set those up to any kind of contract information or whatever, if it's at will, any differentiations you have with that. Leave information could be tracked, so if I'm doing things like FMLA or maternity, that sort of thing. Differentiate that. That's very basic tracking for leave. The HR module does have a absence management component that allows for tracking of absence registrations and approvals. That doesn't quite deal with that. You'll see that here. There's some more employee details. And again, this is mostly informational. There's no real transactional values going on behind here. So, you know, I can enter in information to track basic like leave, PTO, vacation time, but none of that is tracked as the actual benefits. There are benefit accruals that works with payroll, and that can be set up, but this is mostly just informational. Same kind of with time registration, and as well financial dimensions that need to be attached to your worker for finance purposes. I also want to point out too that that can be tracked on the position as well. I don't know if I mentioned that when we were back there. So I mentioned absence information. If you're tracking that, that would be stored here. And again, you're getting a little more detail on that. Compensation information. Now this is important if you're using the compensation module, and that is where any salary information is stored. So when a worker is hired on and you need to track salary information, that's actually going on a compensation plan. Now I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail on that because that's probably the most complex area of AXHR. But I can take a worker and I can assign a compensation plan to them, or compensation plans. There's two types. We have a fixed compensation plan and variable compensation plan. Our fixed compensation plan deals with fixed compensation, things like salaries, things that are regular transactions. Now, if I look here at this worker, you can see our the compensation that they're set up on. And again, we can get pretty complex as far as setting up levels and grades. We can do automated raises, things like that. But this just gives you kind of the basic breakdown of your worker's salary. And you'll see the worker I have here, Alicia, has an hourly pay rate, but then you can see the equivalent breakdowns of that. And the system calculates all of this up. This is one thing with this compensation piece. It's 90% set up and 10% maintenance. And you know, once all of this is set up correctly, it does these calculations for you. And then of course I can, if I were to give my worker a raise, I could pick a action, pick a step in that action, you know, however. And again, you notice that it would automatically, by selecting my step, automatically made that raise equivalent to what it should be. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, the compensation piece is again very complex and very robust, but once it's set up, it actually is pretty cool how it works. Variable compensation plans just deal with things like bonuses, anything that just kind of happens on a one-time basis. Okay, so payroll, that's kind of out of scope here, as well as retail. Those kind of are their own things, but any information relevant to those happen there. Competencies and development. So we looked at how we assign the competencies on the jobs. Here's where we would actually put those in on the worker level. So another thing we can track here is our performance management or development. Again, that's outside of the scope of this. It's its own module. You have the ability to track discussions, things like reviews or you know, accommodations, anything like that. And you have the ability to set goals for your workers, and that kind of all ties into that performance management piece there as well. So again, a lot of things happening here on your worker record. Again, that's the centralized database that pretty much establishes everything. Now, most of what we've looked at have been here kind of in the fast tabs. One thing I just want to point out, and if you are current AX users, you probably already know that there are many different ways of doing the same thing. And you see a lot of this stuff up here on your ribbon bar. So I have tabs that can, if I need to link that worker up to my time and attendance, project management, expense management, payroll. So the worker record allows that. And as well, if I go back here on the grid, here I can scroll through and I can look at a more visual representation of things like my competency, my compensation, and all of that stuff. And then additionally, if I go here, I can click on my employment, get some of that information, or I can click on personal information and look at all of that we looked at. So that is the nuts and bolts of our job, our position, and our worker record. So as we're going through the worker life cycle, we've looked at getting the information being stored in our applications and applicants. We've looked at the onboarding of an applicant to a position assignment. If we were using recruitment, we could actually just go here and hire a new worker, and we could set all that information up from scratch. So that's our hire process. So now what about internal changes that we might make? Let's say we want to take this guy and transfer that worker to another position. Let's see if we have. Let's say our let's say our guy here, Alexander, got a promotion, is going to be a store merchandiser. Set that up for another position. I could put in a reason for making that transfer. I can set my position assignment start and end date times. I think I can set up. Once I do that process, then my worker would then just be transferred over. And again, in this situation here, I would have a lapse in date, but I would want to make sure that I coordinated my dates from that position assignment start and end. Now, the important thing to keep in mind now when that happens is how this affects the effective dating records. One of the things that you'll discover, again, if you're an AX user, you probably have already discovered that everything is very date-driven with date effective records. And that is most clear in the HR side of things with the position, assignment dates, and employment. So if I select a worker, I can go up and I can look at position assignments, and I could add a new assignment here. So let's say Alicia's not making an actual transfer. She's actually taking on a secondary position. So then I could add a second position, add a new assignment to that, whatever, and I could create a new position assignment. Now I can designate to make one primary or secondary, which is mainly just informational, but when I do that, you'll notice that I have now multiple position assignments. And then I could end one without terminating that worker. So that's important. So So again, kind of the same thing happens in the transfer process, but if I've had her working, let's say Alicia's doing both positions for 2 weeks, and I need to go back and we've decided that she's going to move on over, rather than going through that transfer process, I could just come here and end a position assignment. Now, another kind of visual key that we want to look at is the versions. Employment history. If I look here I can see the history of that worker, and we would see that this would refer to the legal entities or companies that that worker is assigned to. And then I can click up here and I have an employment date manager, which actually gives me a fairly detailed breakdown of some other things. If I needed to add an additional employment record here, I could do so. Again, you'll see a little more detailed information on some of those dates. But anytime there's changes made, an additional record is being created. Now, I also would like to show you that that's looking from the worker perspective. Since, again, a lot of emphasis is on that position assignment record, if I go here and I look at versions of that, if I want to look at, how many, who has all filled this position at any given point in time, I can look at that record and I can see the dating information of when those records were created and ended. I can see the actual worker assignments associated to that, position durations, the hierarchy information, and so on. But again, keeping in mind that anytime a new record is created, those details are stored in here, and you can actually view and change that there. So the last part of our process is the retire or terminate. And this is very simple. From our worker record, I can just go in here and I can select the terminate. It's going to add us a termination date, the last day worked. I can assign a reason code, left to work for another competitor. And I also have the ability to retire that position. Typically, you wouldn't do that. Obviously, once this was fulfilled, that position would generally be open to be filled again by another worker, but it does also give you the ability to retire that position completely. So once I click here, I get a info box pop up, lets me know that that position has been terminated. And then now, if I go here and I look at my employment record, see that he now has that termination information listed there. Okay, so we've now looked at the entire worker life cycle from application to retirement. We're just about out of time here. I was going to spend a little bit of time looking at some reports, just a few canned reports, and I have those on the PowerPoint. I'm assuming that this PowerPoint will be made available. And just very quickly, some things like anniversary date information, seniority list, worker distribution graphics by company, distribution totals that you can grab. You can look, and a lot of these kind of help you get compliance reporting, information on male, female, so on, number of positions by department. So that is probably a good time to open up for questions. Before we do that, though, I want to mention that we're now offering, EBEX is offering a couple of HR-related workshops and some things. And we have some information here if you want to get to this and go take a link. Basically, a free workshop to go through requirements and kind of talk about your organization and see if HR is a good fit for you. And if you find that, we're also offering a 2-week workshop and actually doing a very basic out-of-the-box core HR setup. Much of what you've seen here without the recruitment, mainly kind of focusing on the organization, jobs, positions, and workers. mostly for small to small medium companies. I think time-wise, 2 weeks, that's manageable for 100 to maybe 200 employees. But anything bigger would probably get a little bit outside of that. So there's a little more information on that. And if you're interested in that, you can contact Charlotte McCormick or Stephen Wilson in the UK. So there's that, and with whatever time we have left here, about 5 minutes, if we want to open questions.
Yeah, Joe, we did have a question from Daniel early on when you were.
Not exactly sure how that works here.
Well, can you hear me, Joe? Hello? Hey, Joe, can you hear me?
I don't seem to have any audio. Oh.
Okay, weird.
Okay, there we go. Now I hear you. I think maybe just
okay. Yes. So we had a question from Daniel early on when you were looking at the actual at the applications. You were looking at like a position and then people or a job and people applying for it. He was wondering, how do the applications get fed into AX?
Okay, that is a good question. You internally from the enterprise portal, or there can even be links set up to external systems. But actually what happens is that those go into an application basket. So there's kind of a processing area that those get fed into. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail in the recruiting session. I'm trying, my screen's kind of froze up here. I was going to kind of try to show that, but
did you have any other follow-up questions on that, Daniel? I'll unmute you if you want to ask.
Oh, no, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Let me show you. Yeah, so I have this application basket out here, and you can process these, and this kind of shows you where those come in from.
Okay, and then once you process them, they become records in the system. Is that what happens?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and you were right. I mean, we'll make this. We're recording this session, so that'll be made available, and the charts as well, and so people can have that, and then be able to have those links for the next step. If they want to make use of them and have Charlotte's details.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think that's it for now. Like Joe said, there's another one on Friday where he goes more into the recruitment process, so hopefully you'll join us for that if that's something that interests you. And appreciate everybody's time, and y'all take care. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.